What I want to do today, you talked to Brenda, so we have your little personal history recorded. You and I visited. We go back a ways. His dad and my dad and so forth. His dad and myself were involved in citrus. But today, I want to focus on one topic, and I want to focus on the topic of funding citrus research. And you two altered the paradigm and the structure of how we finance citrus research in Florida. And I think that the whole transition and what happens, that story, it needs to be told, because I think it's really a dynamic one and an exciting one. And I was involved to a degree, and so I kind of know what happened. But let's set the stage a little bit with how citrus research was funded in Florida. As I understand it, for many years, the fundings were moved through the IFAS to the University of Florida. So the state of Florida funded it. The federal government put money through USDA, and so we had two agencies that were funding research. Lo and behold, growers felt like that they weren't having much of a say or enough of a say in what research was being done. Is that kind of where things kind of started, where growers got involved? And were you around when the production managers decided that they needed to get involved and made a proposal to have growers tax themselves? That was what, early 90s?
Yeah, John, I would just add one other piece to the funding, and that is the commercial companies, the pesticide and fertilizer companies, would put money into research, and they would give money to IFAS or USDA to study something that they had come up with some kind of a molecule that was going to be an insecticide or herbicide. And it was very successful. However, it did have a reputation that if the product didn't work necessarily, or it did work, either one, the researcher would kind of go down the line of what that company wanted. I don't think that's as true as it was made out to be, but anyway, that was a funding source, and it was a little controversial at times because the companies would really push hard for that researcher to come out and say their chemical was good. That was another method that was out there at the time before the Florida Citrus Production Managers Association started really the what we called the box tax, research box tax, but was actually
Florida Citrus Production Research Advisory Council.
Yeah, that's right.
And the goal with this group, which was known generally as the box tax, was to have an influence on what research was going to be done.
Yeah, and actually to make sure that some of the researchers got funding. What happened, research evolved, as you know. It started off with the USDA and then later University of Florida, and they actually had funding. So they had facilities, they had labs, they hired good people, and they actually got operational funds, and they were doing research, and they were working with growers side by side. As you know, like Dr. Kresdorn and my dad would be riding around the sandhills of Lake County,
Girdling maple trees.
Exactly,
In Orlando.
Doing research. And the research, the public research institutions kind of got away from that, and they ended up, and we didn't really know it, didn't really realize it, kind of missions got changed, and mission creep with universities and with USDA, and then also just budget limitations. They ended up having wonderful facilities, lots of really good people, but they literally didn't have gas to put in the truck to drive to an orange grove to do research. I mean, that literally was what the deal was. And so we're coming along, Citrus Production Managers Association, saying, hey, we need to know about this, and we need to know about that. And you go talk to a researcher, and he goes, I don't have any funds. So that's when the growers got together, and we voted to tax ourselves, which is, an unusual thing for people to do, but so that's how great the need was.
But I will add, we had a model to follow. California was
Right.
ahead of us in this arena. They had started a box tax earlier than we had, and so the founding fathers of ours actually went to California and met with them and talked to them and see how they set theirs up, and then we came back and set it up similar. We didn't follow everything the way they did it, but we did create a box tax somewhat in the image of what they had.
So the effort was made, and growers voted, and that you had to have a certain number, percentage of growers and acreage and everything else. And so the box tax became a viable organization. I think that Jim Simpson was the first
Yes.
chairman of the box tax committee, and so they would request research proposals, and the growers would then review it and recommend. But how much money we're talking about?
So back when the industry was picking anywhere from 200 million to 300 million boxes a year, it would range, it was usually around 1.5 million, but it would range from 1 million to 2 million depending on the ups and downs of production. And Jim Simpson was just a wonderful man and did a great job, and he's just a straight shooter. And the good thing about the Production Research Advisory Council was it was non-political. We didn't care about politics, and we didn't, we just wanted to get answers for growers, and we were just trying to help growers solve problems so we could stay in business. And he did a wonderful job.
Yeah, I know that Jim was the kind of guy that he wasn't highly vocal, but he was extremely thorough, and I know he took that job seriously.
Yeah.
And having been in that position, that is an extremely time-consuming
Yes.
responsibility to go through those research proposals. And in order to kind of help facilitate it, was the scientific advisor, when did that come into? Wasn't there somebody to kind of help out?
Yeah, so part of it is, the great thing about that Research Advisory Council was that left to their own devices, the academic researchers who were very smart, very good people, very well intentioned, but they're academics and they're not always in tune with what growers need. And so the Research Advisory Council would kind of ground truth things and say, is this important to us or is it not important? But then we needed some help, some expertise from the other side of the equation to help explain to us how research worked and a lot about the science. And so we were very fortunate to get Dr. Larry Jackson to assist in that, and he has a wonderful resume, of course, in many different research avenues and research administration and management. But just a first-class individual. So he would help explain to us laymen some of the more difficult parts of the science so that we could get our brains wrapped around it.
So the Box Tax Council is going and moving forward, and you had a little bit of money, but I think you were able to exert pretty good amount of leverage with this because you were encouraging researchers, here's a source of funding, but here's what we'd like to find out. What always impressed me was there were researchers that I say were relevant researchers. The work they did was relevant to the industry. And there were a few that were into, if I'm going to get to be a full professor, I've got to have X number of refereed publications, and they were on a different track and working on their career and everything else. But fortunately, we had a lot of really good, relevant researchers, like a Bob Koo that didn't make any difference to Bob. He was, whatever work he produced was referenced and could be published, but it was always relevant. Every time Bob gave a presentation, you learned something new from it. So this box tax committee grew, and was an important, and every time it was a sunset deal, right? It had to be approved and voted on every so often, what, 7 years or 5 years or something?
The political mechanism was a marketing order, right?
Correct, from the
so
Department of Ag.
The Department of Ag could work that out. So when you do marketing orders through Florida law, you have to have these sunset periods to recreate them for the next 4 years, or, what was this?
I think it was 5 years.
5
but I'm not
years,
certain.
something like that. So yes, you had to go through that, go back out to the industry, make sure that everybody felt like the box tax was earning its keep, and vote again. And so that was a good process, because, the growers, there would be times where there'd be people speak up and say, wait a minute, we're getting off course a little bit. And you'd get back on course because you needed to get that vote to get it reinstituted again for another 5 years. So it was a neat mechanism.
Now, the members of the box tax committee, were they appointed? Who?
They were appointed by the Commissioner of Agriculture of the Florida Department of Agriculture, and they also were appointed by the different areas of the state. So the Indian River, or Polk County, and the different areas, Gulf Coast. So there was representation from the entire industry: fresh fruit people, processing people, growers, orange growers, grapefruit growers, and tangerine growers. And it was voluntary. I mean, we didn't get paid anything. It just took time, and you had to read all those papers. You had to sit down and read a couple hundred dry research proposals every year and try to weigh and adjudicate between them.
Now, were there packers and processors on the box tax, or was this just growers?
Well, this was growers, but they represented those different areas.
Yeah, okay.
But it was definitely heavy to the production manager side.
Yes.
Of the deal. I came in the second phase. Jim had been there. Peter, you might have been in the first group. I mean, there was a bunch of guys. But when Steve Charles got off from Arcadia, Ben Hill Griffin, who owned the majority of Orange Co., wanted somebody on that committee and got me appointed through the Department of Agriculture. So there was some politics a little bit about getting people on and off, but like Peter said, it was a great representation of the entire industry, of having East Coast, Southwest, North guys, and that was valuable to me, as mainly being a Southwest Florida guy my whole career, to hear a Jim Simpson's view about certain things, or to hear a Peter McClure about the East Coast. It was so valuable to me to hear those guys talk and then propose a grapefruit study that I'm thinking, we don't need that. But then you realize it's their livelihood. It's critical to them. And so it was a neat breakup of the industry, how it was set up.
And there was a representative from the Department of Ag that showed up, and they handled all the funding. They collected the tax and distributed the money. So that was good that someone was doing that. But it was mostly still driven by the Production Managers Association, and that just kept it nice and fair to everyone, in my opinion.
So both of you guys served on that box tax committee. What were you had any particular interest in research? What motivated you to do that? You weren't a techie type. Did you work for somebody as a graduate student? A student in school or something? What?
No, not really. I mean, of course, all the people, Dr. Kresdorn and Larry, took a class from him at the University of Florida. And to be intertwined with some of these icons of the industry was really neat to me. But like I say, my boss wanted me on there, and so I said, but I really enjoyed it. Like Peter said, it was a tremendous amount of extra time that was way over and above your normal job with your company and all, that you'd spent nights and weekends, really being prepared for the next meeting. And a lot of times that would involve, selecting people that are going to get research. But I must say there was an advantage to that too, because those researchers would coddle up to you. You know, I mean, they knew you were on the box tax committee, and not in a bad way, but I mean, I got to know so many of them on a personal level that I could call them up and say, hey, we've got something new out here. Can you come take a look at this? You know, Pete Timmer comes down and says, well, that's post-bloom food drop. You know, I've never seen that on oranges in Florida. I've seen it on limes, and I've seen it in South America, but I've never seen it on oranges and navels before. Well, that was kind of generated because I got to know Pete and putting in a lot of research stuff, and he came down there, and as we know, that disease blew up across the industry and became a major thing, but it put me on the inside of it. You know, I love that part of it, being right in the middle of the decisions of how to go about some of these, taking care of some of these new things and diseases and problems that we had.
Well, this guy, he served a remarkable role. How many years were you chairman of a bunch?
I don't know.
A bunch. But McClure's role, and I went to several of these meetings, and McClure's role was he was a translator. And this guy could translate from researchese to Bubba-ese, and not that all the members of the committee were totally lost, but quite truthfully, they didn't really understand all the language of research. And how did you get a hold of this? You seem to have a thesaurus in a dictionary. You could read through the BS and see what the guy was really saying.
Yeah, for Bubba, I was always interested in science. My friends used to, when I was growing up, I was the goofy kid, and they'd say, Mr. Scientific. So I always get teased about that growing up, but I did enjoy it. And
you always wanted the whys, the things, you know, we're going to fertilize. Why do we fertilize? Why do we put this on? Why do we do
I remember
that?
riding in the back seat, and Dr. Krasdorn's in the passenger seat with my dad, and we're riding through those orange groves, and they were talking, you know, just trying to get more production. So I was always interested in science, and actually, I got elected when Jim Simpson retired as the chairman of the Production and Research Advisory Council. As usual, I was 5 minutes late for that meeting. When I walked in the door,
Welcome, Chairman.
Gary Simmons looks around and says, well, y'all want to tell him? and they said, you just got elected chairman.
Well, it was the best thing that happened, I can tell you that. So
There's no doubt. I mean, Peter commanded respect because of the effort he had put into it. You know, I mean, it wasn't like he didn't know what was going on and he's going to tell people this and that. He knew just what you said. He was very involved on the minutest detail level that you can be, and he had our respect.
well, it didn't take the researchers long to realize they weren't going to be as him. You can put out all those fancy words, but you know what's the problem and how you're going to attack it. You know what's going on.
And I enjoyed it. Like Jerry says, being on the inside, I was managing a large citrus operation, and so if I could figure out something that worked earlier than other people, that would help our company. You know, if I could get 10 more boxes or 100 more boxes of fruit per acre, that was a big deal over that many acres. And between that and Florida State Hort Society and those different things, and being on committees at the local research and education centers, you know, like in Fort Pierce, you know, there were answers out there to questions that we had, and also research changes and evolves with technology. I mean, when Dr. Koo did his fertilizer research, nobody was using microjet. It's all rainfall. You know, microjet changed everything on that. It changed the greasy spot equation. You know, when your leaves are rotting and producing spores, well, it used to rot with only when the summer rains came, but when you start irrigating every day in the springtime, that changes that equation. And so I just always was always interested in trying to figure that out so I could grow a better crop.
Well, I know people would ask Jim, and Jim was a private grower, so there wasn't any boss that he had to answer to. Why do you spend all your time doing this? Jim was on my advisory committee. Jim went to all these meetings. And his response was, hell, if I can just pick up one little thing here, one little thing there that helps, look at the tremendous impact. And so he had people that could run the farm. I mean, he wasn't worried about having to make sure the tractor was running. He had a good mechanic, and they got stuff done. But he was gathering these little bit of tidbits. And like you said, if you increase production by 2% across 20,000 acres, that's pretty damn significant. Mm-hmm. So we're rocking along now, and we're getting in $1 million, $2 million a year, and research is hanging in there, and there's not a whole lot of grants that are going on. Private companies have some grants, but it really wasn't much of a grant deal. I believe way up into, well, past the box tax formation, USDA wouldn't have any. There was no grants at all in that organization, and so they were 100% funded by USDA. But things changed. We had a problem that developed in 2004, 2005, somewhere like that, and so a little bug introduced a bacteria into the state of Florida, and so greening arrived, and the game was going to change dramatically. And when did you realize that we were in one hell of a problem with greening?
Well, in the Production Research Advisory Council, our goal on purpose, being growers, was we wanted to do, we didn't want to do fundamental research in a lab that took 10 or 15 years or forever or never to get to the field. We were trying to do, boots on the ground stuff in the grove that made a difference to us in the short term.
You didn't care whether the Krebs cycles function in a tangerine or a grapefruit.
Exactly, yeah. And prior to greening came, of course, we had a huge deal with canker. And so we ended up shifting a lot of our resources to canker research, again, just trying to battle that. And that was a huge deal. I mean, we lost a lot of acres. I mean, the company I worked for had 4,000 acres burned. So we were trying to get ahead of canker, and there was a lot of research wrapped around that. And so we learned a lot about research funding, and then of course trying to learn about canker and get ahead of that. And the canker eradication program, it kind of failed because of some of the rules and regulations that the government put in place negated your ability to actually get ahead of it. When I found it in Bluefield Grove at Evans Properties, Dr. Gottwald's science said if you push that 1,900-foot circle within 30 days, you have a 95% chance of getting ahead of it. So I'm calling saying, hey, I found it. Y'all come push this circle. And it was 40 days before they showed up. And I remember, and I'm calling every day, And finally 25 pieces of heavy equipment roll in the gate one morning, and they start pushing. I show them where, and they start pushing. And I'm like, okay, fine, it's springtime. Summer rains hadn't started. Hopefully I'm still okay. 3 hours later, 25 pieces of heavy equipment roll out the gate. And I'm raising hell with the USDA saying, what's going on? And of course I can't find an answer. It takes you 3 days to find an answer. Well, they fired the contractor because he had hired local operators to ride the equipment, to drive the equipment, and that was against the rules. And I'm like, well, why is that? And they said, because it's a rule. I said, well, change the rule.
Ignore the rule for a while till you get out of my grove.
It was 3 more months before we got that, and then we lost control of that. So that's why we lost 4,000 acres. But so when greening hit, so the bug came in 1998, maybe?
Psyllid.
The psyllid. And
2005.
Yeah, is when we first, but I remember in between that, we looked, there was no one doing research on greening anywhere in the world, really. There had been some done in China, maybe some in Japan, like decades ago. Know about USDA, know about University of Florida. Of course, growers, hell, had never really heard of it. I remember one of the pathologists at IFAS in Lake Alfred said, you know, canker's the common cold and greening is liver cancer. You know, and
That phrase has changed my whole trajectory about the box tax and money. It was in Sebring. They had a big meeting with all the growers. It's packed house, as packed as you can get that Civic Center in Sebring full. And Steve Garnsey stood up in front of that group, who was a USDA researcher, Dr. Garnsey.
Yeah, that's right.
Who had been to China, had been to India, had seen greening, had dealt with it some, and he made that statement. And you couldn't have stuck a ice pick through my heart any harder when I heard that statement. And years later, people still didn't get that you know, it was going to be that bad. And so that changed my whole thinking, and not my boss's thinking, but my thinking that this is a bad cat, and it's going to take more resources than what we have today.
And the box tax people, you realize that not only was there greening, but there were other issues that weren't in Florida yet. And don't you think that we'd be better off if we had an idea of what they were, how they behaved, and what we could do to intercept them? And if we wait until we've got the pancreatic cancer, we're in trouble. But if we can do something to prevent it.
Right, and I remember we had a debate probably around 2000, a couple years after the psyllid got here. And we all had psyllid, but it was innocuous. By itself, it really wasn't a problem. The only problem is carried greening, and I was like, well, no one's spending money on greening research. We ought to do some greening research. And a lot of people would say, well, why do we want to spend money on something we don't have? You know, and that
it got voted down.
Yeah.
The bottom line is, and that goes back to the group of growers sitting around that table. We just didn't all feel the same, you know, and so we had. I was going to bring that up, that we had projects brought before the committee that we turned down several years before we got the disease, but it definitely changed everything from that point on.
And when we did get it, of course, now we're all mostly highly concerned. And again, there was a lot of people in the industry that said, oh, this is just, they always say that. You know?
We've gone through boring nematode, we've gone through diaprepes, and hell, we've gone through canker. And look.
And the one thing that happened was, the reason I brought up canker was, they gave up on the canker eradication program. They failed at the execution of it. Blamed it on the hurricanes. Not really the hurricanes, but the hurricanes.
That was a good scapegoat right there.
So they gave up on that, but the failure of that and the cost of that meant that no one had the stomach to do a greening eradication program. So that was just kind of off the table. So then it's like, okay, well, this is here, and now we got to live with it, so we better figure out how to manage it. And so we deduced pretty quickly that we didn't have a big enough stick. Our $1 or $2 million a year really wasn't a big enough stick, and it was a whole lot more than field research. There had to be a lot of fundamental research, because nobody knew anything about the insect. Nobody knew anything about the bacteria, and they didn't really know what it did in the tree. And so that whole disease triangle thing, we just, all three anchor points of that, we just didn't know what was going on, and so it was going to take a lot of research on that to figure it out. So that's I remember when the Box Tax Council basically told everybody, I don't know, probably 2006 or 7, I forget which year, we're not going to spend any money on anything else except green. And a lot of researchers didn't like that. I mean, they were doing research on herbicides or doing research on
irrigation and nutrition. Yeah.
All that's important, but it's not important if this one existential threat's going to take you out.
I jumped in about that time. I retired in 2006, and it took me about 6 or 8 months to get really bored. And when the Research Coordinating Council position became available, so I jumped in, and we had the Greening Task Force, or whatever we called this, the group that you chaired, that met, and it seemed to me that there was a relatively small number of people who really felt the ice pick and knew that we were in for a real battle. But most of the people really still were looking at burrowing nematode kind of a thing. Yeah, we'll deal with this.
Well, and that's what Jerry and I and the other people at the Production Managers Association and the Research Advisory Council, it was an uphill battle.
Well, I'll say.
And so we invented these other things really just as a way to just outreach and education. And we were going to have to sell this. We weren't just going to be able to say, hey, this is a big bad wolf. We got to do something, because everybody didn't pay attention. So it was going to take a large effort. So this was all strategically done so that we could hopefully educate enough people to get them on board.
So there were several things that took place. How did the Death March idea come to you?
You just stay up too late at night worrying about stuff. But I was playing on a spreadsheet, and I thought, okay, if the Silk comes to Miami in 1998 or whatever it was, and there's one tree in somebody's backyard that they brought home from Thailand or wherever and planted in their backyard because they ran a restaurant and they needed curry leaves. They had other stuff that they brought in, that was infected. It makes no difference if there's not a psyllid. And if they're not cutting budwood and putting it in a commercial nursery, it makes no difference. It can live and die on its own. So I just put down one, and I said, okay, well, let me double this. Let me double this every month or every 3 months. And I just plotted that out, and it's imperceptible. At the time we had, 90 million trees in the state. Well, that line stays flat for years until all of a sudden you hit that hockey stick part. And I was just like, okay, well, we're right here. This is next. We got to tell everybody. So I would show that spread. I'd go to, on a tour, on a whistle stop tour, and show that spreadsheet, which I just made up, but it made sense to me.
And when we started with the greening, there were a couple decisions I think that were made. I think the government decided, and I don't know who made this decision, that the way to attack greening was not like we attacked canker with a regulatory deal, where we were going to do the old seek and destroy. I mean, that was Ernie Ducharme's and what was the guy at Southern Gardens? Anyway, they were on this seek and destroy, right? You find a greening tree, and you push it and this kind of a thing, but there's no compensation, so there was no payment that was going to be made, so growers weren't going to be compensated. We weren't going the route that we did with canker.
Well, again, there just wasn't any stomachs for anyone to even
It didn't work for canker. We put a bunch of money into it, and now we're having to live.
I mean, it could have and should have worked, and it would have worked for greening, perhaps, but we just weren't going to do it. It wasn't going to happen.
Yeah, they're doing
we could never sell that.
They're doing it in California now, but they got early enough. So
and they were doing it successfully in Brazil and still are today.
Yeah.
I mean, they have chunks of Brazil that are still under the slash and burn policy, and they're surviving. But even Brazil has grown to where more and more growers didn't have the stomach to keep pushing. And so they have a large percentage that now doesn't push either.
And we
at
probably
some
have
point.
30 or 40 million trees in people's backyards in Florida. So you have, and that was a problem with canker, was going to be a problem with greening, and they don't have that issue in Brazil because it's not legal for them to have a citrus tree in their backyard.
But to back up, something that Peter had said is we were the Bubbas, we were the production managers, and you had people within the industry that are saying, we can survive this, and yet we're on the ground floor saying, we don't think you can survive this, we've got to come up. And that was the idea of the Production Managers Association played a big role in this, of creating the task force. And the idea of creating the task force was to bring in people from processing, research, Susan Halbert with the Department of Agriculture, to bring people into this committee. And so that it would have a little bit more acceptance among the CEOs of the industry and of processing and packing, that, hey, there's more to it than just what some of these production managers are saying. And so who sat on that committee that I want to make sure this goes down on the record that was critical? Calvin Arnold and Harold Browning. Mm-hmm. Those two guys bought in immediately that this is a game changer. And then somebody else that really was good at playing politics, and he was absolutely put in the vice, was Mike Sparks. Mm-hmm. We made sure he was on that committee. And there Mike Sparks is in those meetings where, you were the representative or the
research coordinator.
I mean, you're sitting in there and Mike Sparks is hearing everything we're hearing, and yet he's going back to his association where guys are saying, well, we're not going to do that. We're not going to do that. And Mike's like, we got to do that. I mean, I'm hearing it with my own ears. I'm hearing what's going on. So that group was a very diverse group of our industry, and to a person said, we've got to put a bigger effort into this. Okay, we don't necessarily going to do slash and burn, but we've got to figure out, can we even grow the bacteria? We don't know all these things about greening. We've got to get there if we're going to try to come up with some answers. So in my opinion, that task force, like Peter said, strategically got people involved that we needed to have involved, because what was our end game? We had to increase the dollars. Somehow we had to increase the dollars.
And the funding effort. And you were part of the strategy. Your communication skills and your knowledge of the industry and different facets of it and everybody in it. We said, hey, let's go get John. He's good at talking.
Oh, no, you were a great personality, and you go in there with an open mind, and within a very few number of meetings and talking about where we're headed, holy mackerel, we've got to change the paradigm of how we're getting money. We've got to get more money. And it was a really tough political, and I'm non-political and he's non-political, but some others are very political and they're good at it. But it was tough for us on our own. We had to get these other people involved that could play the politics.
Well, so
let me just finish though. As a key thing, part of the politics is, where was the money in the industry? The Department of Citrus. And that money, there was already a major battle politically among growers and processors and everything about, should we advertise or should we not advertise? And generally speaking, the big guys didn't want us to advertise, the little guys wanted us to advertise. We come to the conclusion at that task force is, we've got
that was the only source of funding.
We've got to get that funding.
IFAS didn't have that much money. USDA did. and here's $20 million sitting there, or $60 million.
Well, they were spending $60 or $70 million a year on advertising at the Department of Citrus.
That's where, you know, an hour before that meeting, the three of us, which we're fixing to have another 15 people come join us, the three of us sit in there and say, okay, it's 60 million. We can take this, we can do this, we can do that, we can probably sell, and we come back and say 20 million. I think we can get 20 million.
We have to get 20 million.
Yeah, but there's more. You could have got 30,
Right,
or we could have got 40, but we can sell maybe 20.
Right.
And so the politics though was tough because the growers that didn't want to lose marketing felt like there was something devious going on. This was about stopping marketing. And it took that group that had a lot of credibility to go talk to people and say, it has nothing to do with the advertising. It has all to do with giving money for HLB research.
Well, the response was, if you don't have a crop,
Right.
what have you got to market?
Right.
We were already selling everything we had.
Yeah.
It wasn't like we weren't. And we had boxes somewhere we couldn't sell. We were selling everything we had.
And a lot of these big decision makers were spreadsheet numbers people. They weren't in the grove looking at things. Didn't you take a group on a tour? Didn't you load them up and say, you want to see what you want to see if you don't put money into it, what can happen?
We took the Citrus Commission. I brought them down to Bluefield, and they almost didn't come. It was real. They basically there was a group of the Citrus Commissioners said they didn't even want to go on the tour.
No, we don't need it.
Well, it's
I got a processing plant.
Evans is anti-marketing.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that this is a ploy by them to get
See,
rid of that market.
and I'll say to the credit of the company I worked for, and they didn't believe in the marketing order because they didn't think it worked. But nobody at Evans, none of the Evanses, and my boss Ron Edwards, never ever told me to do or say one thing or another. They absolutely never even discussed the box tax committee with me or any of that. So I was on my own on that, and I'd go in and tell my boss, he goes, well, just keep working at it, do the best you can. He stayed totally out of it, and I give them credit for that. I got zero direction or pressure from them, and
No roadblocks,
Yeah.
no cattle prod or anything.
Yeah.
Mine was the opposite. Is we've got to get money for greening research. You know, you've got to get it. Forget everything else. Well, forget all the other politics. We've got to get greening research.
But it was real hard when people, up here that were making 600-800 boxes an acre, beautiful groves, to, people, humans, all human beings, as we've seen in our own pandemic, we're just bad at risk assessment. When you're on a beach and all the water goes out, the fish are flopping, and everybody says, wow, that's cool. And they're just wandering around out there. And on the horizon, the tidal wave is stacking up. Humans don't understand that that's a problem. We don't see that. And I was interested in the psychology because I had a hard time understanding why other people didn't see it. To me, it was so clear. So, there's a fine line between being Paul Revere and Chicken Little. And do you know at the time which one you are? We were trying to be Paul Revere, but everybody else thought we were Chicken Little.
The one thing I repeated over and over that seemed to work the best, and it was at the Peace River Valley Growers Association. We had to take our tour to all the different places. And so I'm sitting around that room and I'm looking at somebody that has a lot of respect in that room. And, so I get up in front of the group and I basically, and his name's, I'm struggling with his name, but Krause, Bobby Krause. Great reputation in that area of Wauchula, DeSoto County. And I turned to Bobby and I said, Bobby, did you ever have any groves that had tristasia, that sour orange grove? Yeah. What happened? Well, they ended up dying. They did. Okay, well, what'd you do? Well, I went back and planted a grove. What did you plant more sour orange? No, I put Carrizo in there. Is that still a grove today? Yeah, it's a grove today. What if you couldn't have put a a rootstock that wouldn't have grown back, what would you do? Well, I'd be out of business. I turned to the group and I said, that's what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
There is no rootstock today, but we need to find one. We need to find some answers to this. Right now, what he just said is what's happening. And I learned real quick I could use that wherever I went.
Yeah.
And that was a very powerful thing. They could relate to that because it's heartbreaking to lose an 800 box an acre grove on sour orange.
Yeah.
That you had to literally push and start over again. And then when you came back 10 years later, it wasn't 800 boxes an acre anymore. You know, it was hard to get it there, you know, on a second time. But anyway, that was a powerful message that finally resonated through the industry. And it goes back to a Department of Citrus meeting down at the Mutual's big annual expo at Bonita Springs, and I went and played golf that day. I didn't go to the meeting. I had worked everybody as hard as I could work them for a month, and I said, it's up to other people now that they respect that are a part of it. And I'll never forget Ken Keck at the dinner that night pulled me aside and said, you son of a gun, you didn't even go to the dad burn meeting and you know what was fixing to happen. I said, no, Peter and John and I, we've been up to our eyeballs in this. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but there wasn't anything more I could say at that meeting that was going to make a difference, or Peter or you or anybody else was going to make a difference that day. We had done our work. And so what ended up happening is the people that had been against us were for us, and when they spoke up and said, it was a done deal.
Now this was a commission meeting. It took place there, wasn't it?
Yeah. And back to the commission, they did come before Pierce, and they did come to our groves, and as we learned later, you know, greening, it takes out like any pandemic, it takes the weak out first. Well, East Coast groves have always been weak compared to Ridge and
You'd love to
West
have a
Coast
400
groves.
box per acre grove.
400 is great down there. It was mostly 200 or 250. So you got salty water and poor soils and very shallow root systems. But they came and, you know, I loaded them up on a picking bus and drove them around and showed them where greening was taking trees out that we were losing, and they were dying. It looked as awful as it looks, and then showed them other parts of the grove that still looked good. And so, so their credit there came, and back to Ken Keck and Bob Norberg. Those were the executives that were running the Department of Citrus, and give them a lot of credit because it's really hard for they're in their position. They're supposed to be there to market citrus. That's the whole point of the Department of Citrus. You know, some regulatory aspects on just weights and measures, and you know, just you know, housekeeping, things like that. But they got it because they attended the meetings, and they didn't put up roadblocks, and they could have. They probably could have killed the whole deal, but they did not. To their credit, they were honest and straight about it and did a good job in the background for us, which really helped.
You know, for years, it was always, the commission always said, our responsibility is in the research arena, we'll fund processing, but we're not allowed to fund production research. And we all heard that. That's what we all heard. And I'll never forget this. Before one of the Citrus Commission meetings, I said, Ken, I'd like to see the regulation in your guidelines that say that you can't do production research. And you know what he told me? John, it really isn't there. It's always been a gentleman's agreement. And so they perpetuated this idea that we couldn't spend a dime of our box money from the Department of Citrus on production research because I don't know which gentleman agreed on it, but somebody agreed that wasn't going to happen. But for years we accepted that as a hard and fast rule in their guidelines, and it never was. It never was part of that. They had the freedom to do it. And they did some research. They had, hell, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have had the guys at Lake Alfred that came up with FCOJ. They put money into processing.
So we went to the DOC because they had money that growers controlled. It was grower money out of grower pockets that growers controlled. And you're right. Going to Tallahassee to try to get the money wasn't an option at the time, and going to Washington wasn't an option. And there was $60 or $70 million a year that growers did have say in, and to say, okay, well,
that's
we were trying not to be greedy, so we just said, hey, let's see if we can get 20.
I think he came up with 20. That was his sub.
And it took a while, and it took several years, and it took effort and some organization and the coordinating council and.
Well, the piece that's kind of missing so far is the evolution of the box tack committee itself.
Right.
In the fact that Peter, I mean, this is Peter's boat that he was driving, and it was powerful. That we had to come up with a better organization of understanding the science to be able to approve. It's going to be too technical for us, and we need a better, a model of how to operate this. And that's where the Tom Turpin, the idea of building a different entity that could control this whole research arm for greening, because it's going to be more than we can handle.
Right, and let's talk about some of the other things that led up to that. You talked about Bob Norberg, and Bob was a marketing guy and everything else, but I think Bob was the one that said, well, why don't we get some really smart people to look at this problem? And he went and made arrangements for us to go visit with the National Academy.
Yes.
And so we go and we say, well, they're out of the citrus industry, they're really smart people, and let's let them look at the problem and come up with how we should go about attacking the problem.
And once the Department of Citrus agreed to the funding, I mean, we knew we needed a bigger stick, money-wise, and then also, if we couldn't get that, we couldn't do much. But once they agreed to that, then it's like, okay, well, the mechanism we have with our box sets, there are some limitations working through the Department of Ag at the time. We couldn't own intellectual property. We couldn't necessarily negotiate with other institutions outside of the state and things like that. So that's when we said we need a different organization. And you're right, Bob went to the National Academies, and we decided internally we needed a Manhattan project. So then Bob gets those guys and gets them to agree to help us. And they put a panel together, just brilliant people from all over the country, and they came and did a serious deep dive into the citrus industry and our organizations and our funding that we had available, and the disease, and they realized how bad it was.
Yeah, their job wasn't to find a solution to greening. Their job was to identify a road to travel to get to that point, and they came up with a great master plan to do that. So the next step that took place was that...
and a concurrent thing that happened was Mike Sparks took us to Washington. Adam Putnam was there at the time. And we went to the USDA. And I remember sitting in the head of the entire USDA. His father's the one that came up with the screwworm solution on irradiating the males, making them sterile. Gosh, I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. I know the guy's name, but his office is a big plate glass window, and you can see the Capitol dome right there. He's got a fancy office in Washington, and he sits down. Got about 8 minions around
all
him.
the little assistants around there.
And there's Mike Sparks and myself and several other Bubbas and from the growers from the citrus industry, and we're there to talk about greening and it was an election year, and they just all had a hangdog look on their face, and they just looking down at the floor and telling us they couldn't help us, and it was just really weird and odd, and I didn't figure it out for a while, but about 20 minutes into it, and this was after we had gotten agreement from the DOC to have funding. After about 20 minutes, I figured out, oh, they think we're here to ask for money. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. We don't need your money. We got $20 million. We need your brains.
We need your scientists.
You've got 2,100 PhD scientists across the world. We don't know who your smartest bacteria guy is, or your smartest, epidemiologist, or we don't. But you do, and we need those guys to come help us, along with the academies, science, and help us build this roadmap to try to solve the problem. And they lit up like a Christmas tree when they found out that we weren't there asking for money, that we had our own money. We just were asking for brain power. It was really amazing how that happened.
And I was there. I'm pretty sure I was there at that meeting, and I can remember. And I had been interacting with those people through the little organization that Ted Badkin ran, and I got in as the what do they call them, the representative from Florida, and I learned a lot from Ted Badkin how to manipulate USDA people. I never got to the level that he did. He had an inside track on all of that, but you figured out how they ran. So once we got to that point, but the next step, Jerry, though, was, like you said, it was beyond the box tax realm. And I remember that somebody hired an attorney and got a nonprofit organization put together called the Advanced Citrus Technology Corporation, right? I believe that the three officers of that corporation are here, and we were set because we realized that if this was going to go, that we needed to have an entity that could handle more than the money that the old box tax was, and that there were a lot of other auxiliary things that needed to be taken into account, patent rights and all that kind of stuff. So we were set to go, right? We had the corporation there, and we were ready to take the money from the Department of Citrus and run with it. And then,
I think at the time the National Academies had written their report and kind of had an idea of what to do, and then we're just trying to figure out what is the next step. And three of us just thought that it would probably be better to make this a private organization. If we were getting public-private partnership with the Department of Citrus to do this.
And that came from Tom Turpin, who had been hired as a consultant for us. But Tom's comment makes me smile to this day. He goes, every state has a 100-year-old university that's a monster bureaucracy.
Right.
Every state has a leg of the USDA that's a monster bureaucracy. We need something that can go fast, quick, and privately. We can make this happen very fast. And I don't know where to jump in and say this, but I want to say it, that one of the decisions that we made to try to do the private probably wasn't the right decision. It hurt my feelings. We got beat up politically over it, but the fact was we weren't going to get a lot of this money ultimately that came directly from the state or through the Citrus Commission if you had a private entity. Going from public to private was a challenge. And then I look back, after that happened, now it's how many years, going back to 2006 or 7, somewhere in there. 2009 is when the CRDF actually became official, but it was operating before that time. But could we have gained a couple of years? Absolutely. Would those couple of years made the difference of the $100 million we got since that came from public to public instead of public to private? So anyway, I'm here to admit that I wanted that badly. It would have sped some things up, but we would have never got all this other outside money, I don't think.
And I have a different take, because at the time Norberg agreed that he would cut us a check, you know, and so I mean I still think at the end of the day it may have been the right thing to do. We failed politically. We went and talked to the president of the Senate at the time, and he agreed for us to, as you know, for us to work with ACT. Advanced Citrus Technology.
He agreed.
Yeah, he agreed at that meeting. So we thought we had the green light. Norberg was going to cut us a $400,000 check from the DOT to get started, and we'd be operational. So we were that close to being operational with that entity. Then there was some political change of heart in the background that we weren't necessarily privy to, and the Senate president pulled his support for that, and wanted it to be a direct service organization to the university instead. I a little bit different take on Jerry. I think we still could have been successful with the private thing. It would have looked different. University of Florida did not interfere in the first 6 or 8 or 10 years. They probably did interfere after that in a negative way, but Tom Turpin was you know, we hired him on purpose because he was an entrepreneur. He did have an academic background. He was well schooled in that, very smart on the science, and then also on how to set organizations up and run them, and again, be entrepreneurial and move fast, which was important.
Yeah, the idea of having an organization that was designed and set up to handle dollars and administer research,
Yeah.
Was there, and whether it was public or private, I know I would have liked to have had it be a private deal, and even though we were told, oh, you're completely autonomous, the guidelines specifically point out that if the president of the university doesn't like what you're doing, he'd get rid of you. He could change the whole thing. I mean, they tried that, but
Yeah, they pulled that card. Fortunately, we got it beat back, but they did pull the card.
I mean, heck, if they can tell the athletic association what to do, they can control most anything else.
And again, all the land-grant universities have they operate differently now than they did 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and they think their mission's bigger than ag industries within their state. You know, I remember writing a letter to the vice president, and you know, because he was bragging on studying yellow-bellied marmots in British Columbia, and wild mustangs in Utah, and blue-tongued sheep in Nepal, and I was like, what are you doing?
That's not your mission.
None of that has anything to do with the state of Florida. You're the land-grant university for the state of Florida, you know.
Well, you also wrote a letter, because I showed him a program in the University of Florida, and it had the trustees in there. There was nobody in agriculture.
Correct.
In the trustees. And you wrote a letter that ended up in the citrus industry as an opinion, because I had been feeding you because I knew you'd say it. But the truth was, we needed to have some ag people on the trustees.
Yeah.
Because they wanted to be in the top 10 universities. Well, you have to count your IFAS people, your ag people in that. So you can never be in the same category of rating with Harvard and Yale, but the University of Michigan and Georgia and all, you can be in the top 10 of them, which we were. But to get to that another top, you had to get away from agriculture because of the extension gave you that number of people that you needed to have that number of dollars, and nobody was going to reach that.
Yeah,
no ag land grant university would ever reach that.
Yeah, and the whole reason for land grant colleges was to educate farmers. It was all about
all of us
agriculture.
collectively wouldn't starve to death.
That's
It was
right.
very successful.
when 80% of us are feeding 20%, we got to change that around. So we did. Well,
But I will say this, after all that was done and you know, the dynamics of changing the funding, and that worked.
Yes.
I mean, it literally has
That did
worked
work.
over a decade, you know, where we've gotten the money. What hadn't worked is us finding a solution.
right. But
And
so-
I want to add one other thing, though, that's just come up here in the last few months, where people within the industry were extremely upset. There's an article that was going around that came from South Africa, because South Africa had greening. They just had a different type bacteria, but it was still similar, you know, into the class of calling it greening. Well, they did a bunch of research, and there's a paper in 1973 that scientists in South Africa used oxytetracycline, OTC, and the long story short, the ending said, we figured out how to cure greening. Now it's the farmer's job to figure out how to deliver this material. I never saw that piece of work. And we paid IFAS and paid the USDA to go look at prior research. We actually funded that. And even so far, I remember being on the East Coast at the USDA Center, they were going to go look for gray papers, which I wouldn't know what a gray paper is. That's one that technically hadn't been published, but it's in the files a lot of places. We paid somebody to go do that. And that piece of work, I'm curious if you guys had ever seen it, because this steel comes out with Oxytec. We figure out how to get it into the tree. And in 72, I think it was, what did I say, 71 or 72, they had already figured that out. It was just coming up with a more easier way of getting it done, a practical way of getting it done.
Into the flow, yeah.
And had we taken many researchers and millions of dollars, I think we'd have figured that out a decade ago.
And I think there was a time when the regulatory climate in Washington was just not going to allow us to use antibiotics. And so we were concerned about spending millions of dollars and then just not being able to get through the door.
yeah, there was a group that thought they could get penicillin labeled for citrus.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and the guy that was over the EPA that was regulating it had a child that was allergic to to antibiotics. And he basically told Harold Browning, it's not only no, but hell no.
Yeah.
But the funny thing about that paper from South Africa, it said penicillin didn't work. And yet at our arboretum right here where we sprayed penicillin, it worked with just water.
Yeah.
You know, with nothing but just spraying it with water. So there's a lot of regrets out there, you know. It bothers me, you know, $100 million, several hundred of the smartest people on this planet, we got involved. And yet I think of AIDS, where they've spent $1 billion and thousands of researchers, and they still don't have the answer to it. You know, and yeah, it's a virus versus a bacteria, but the point is, there's things in nature that we just can't figure out.
Yeah, you know, a good analogy would be malaria. And the world collectively spends about $2.5 billion a year on malaria research. It still kills between 500,000 and 1 million people a year. We've known what it is for almost the same length of time as greening has been around, 120 years or so. They're just now coming up with a vaccine for malaria, you know, after all of that and all those human deaths. So I remember talking to Bill Dawson, and he's brilliant. When we first got CRDF off the ground and launched and had the academies and their scientific panel, and we started really doing good work. I think at one point in time we were funding research with 19 land-grant universities in 13 different countries, and I mean in the United States, and then also with university or research institutions in 13 different countries. We were like, we don't care who has the answer. We want to fund the best and the brightest in the whole world that can work on this. And I think we effectively did that. But Bill Dawson, and I pulled him aside one day and said, hey, you know, what are our chances? You know, this was really early on, probably 2009 or 10. He goes, you're going to have to get lucky to beat this. He goes, this is really hard science. And he says, most people don't comprehend how difficult the science is. But if you do the research, you might get lucky. If you don't do the research, you won't get lucky. You know, so, and that's a conscious decision, do you fight it or not? So we could have collectively said, well, we're going to give up. We fought it, haven't won yet. Maybe we will.
Well,
But we certainly know a lot about it now that we didn't know then.
yeah, I think all three of us, if back when we realized it was going to take a research to solve the problem, I think all three of us, if someone said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to give you $100 million and access to all the scientists in the world, we'd said, it's a done deal.
Yeah.
Man, this is no
Yeah.
problem at all.
Yeah.
We solved problems all along with far less money and far less people than that. So to tie it to the next step, so the CRDF, Citrus Research and Development Foundation, was established as a part of what's a term for the university?
DSO, Direct Service
A
Organization.
direct service organization. So in essence, it was under the auspices of the University of Florida, but it operated autonomously for quite a while, and it basically then became the reservoir for research dollars, and that in turn changed the structure of research that was done. So rather than funding the University of Florida, funding 85 faculty members at Lake Alfred, they didn't really change the structure of funding faculty members. What happened was the faculty member then went to CRDF, got money, and then hired a staff. And so now where Stilinski was an entomologist and had a couple of technicians, he applies for grants and gets a bunch of money, and now he becomes a research coordinator. So the faculty positions didn't increase, but now we've got all these postdocs and everything else. So the whole structure.
And I think it worked out really well. Again, the original box tax committee, the Florida Citrus Production Research Advisory Council, we voluntarily quit doing business and rolled over to the CRDF, got it organized, got it set up, got it structured, got it funded. It mimicked the box tax committee. It mimicked that in many ways because it had growers basically making the decisions and adjudicating and evaluating all the research proposals. But then we got professional staff. We hired a Turpin. Later we hired Harold Browning. And we had an accountant on staff. And they did a really good job. We're still lean and mean, but did a really good job and amplified the research, got it out there, had some money where you can attract some brilliant people to come work on our problem from all over the world. And all that worked. And I think we managed the money very well, and I think CRDF did a really good job doing that and coordinating and managing the research. And again, we followed what the Academy of Sciences, and I think they did a good job for us, how they laid out what the directions we should take on the research. Like Bill Dawson said, it's a really hard problem.
Yeah, we had some great ideas too. We were hoping that as the researchers discovered techniques and everything that could be patented and revenue generated from that, and it all was great ideas, but it all hadn't quite fallen into place.
Well, at the time, we didn't have the citrus genome wasn't sequenced. The first time we did it cost $3 million.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
You can do it for $30 now, right?
That's right. You can do one overnight.
But and I remember a lot of times we'd sit around and we'd have these arguments. Well, I don't want to fund that. It's going to take 10 years. So okay, well, 10 years is going to come and go, and we, whether we find the answer or not. But if this is what it takes to get the answer 10 years from now, it's going to always take 10 years.
You got to start sometime.
If we don't, if we wait 5 years to start, it's still going to take 10 years. 10
Yeah,
years.
that was an internal battle that
Yeah.
went on. It's still going on to this day, and instead of 10, we talked 20.
Right.
It's going to take 20 years. And my answer always was, well, if you wait a year, it's 20 years, 1 year.
Right.
It's 20 years, 2 years. Now, we've cut into that 20 years. We're way into that now. So we're within 5 years of having something that will work. And if you include CRISPR into that discussion, it's going to be less than 5 years. We'll have something. I mean, we already have a Hamlin that doesn't get canker right now. And he's close to having a Valencia that doesn't get greening.
That's awesome.
The question is, what does that do? What does that trigger? Something like bad sugar or bad taste or something. But no, that was always an internal battle. And I'll never forget an argument, and I won't name any names, but somebody was giving us a hard time about long-term research, and said, well, you guys you just get a check. You're just production managers. You just get a truck. I said, so Peter McClure's 5th generation citrus, he just gets a check? And they go, well, I didn't know. I said, yeah, 5th generation. I'm only 2nd generation, but I depend on that check. That's my livelihood. I've got to have that check, and I'm going to do whatever I can to keep it here forever. So where is this coming from?
Yeah.
But we were able to win that battle about the long term to keep. It's still hard to manage. You have this big ball of money and a bunch of people, throwing stuff in there. But the real bottom line is long-term research of developing varieties takes a lot of effort and money, because you got to keep managing it as an orange grove, and that's big dollars. And yet, I think, again, the industry did a good job of balancing that. It's just not easy. There's products out there that we use on citrus today that within 15 minutes, it's in the plant, sitting right next to the bacteria. Right there, 15 minutes. But it doesn't kill it. And we can't find one that does, except these antibiotics. And that has definitely, in my opinion, so far, it's buying us time.
Right. And the other thing about developing the CRDF is that one thing that we learned, at the box tax committee, and then as we were trying to scale up, we needed to scale up our operation because greening was bigger than anything we had, bigger than anything UF or USDA had put in place to work on it. A lot of the academic guys, you're right, they get evaluated on a refereed paper. It doesn't have to lead to anything useful, just the refereed paper. And we wanted to make sure that we hooked it up to a tractor and got it to the grove. And that was always a missing piece. Well, it wasn't always. And it evolved over 50 years ago. They were doing that. Then they went away from that. And growers were kind of asleep at the wheel and kind of let the universities get away from their original mission. And we were too busy being football fans and rah, go Gators. And we kind of let the mission creep of the actual hardcore research. The citrus industry in Florida is way more important than the Gators. But we just kind of let that school spirit kind of mask their deficiencies. Yeah. And so the good thing about what we did at Box Tax and then later in a bigger way at CRDF was trying to make sure that if something was working, it just didn't get put on a shelf and gather dust in an office in Gainesville somewhere or Beltsville or wherever, that we could actually get it commercialized and into the field. And that's where hiring a Turpin was really helpful to us to try to cross that bridge and put those pieces together.
Now, I don't think the Department of Citrus puts any money into CRDF, do they?
Well, they don't have any.
No, it comes straight from the legislature.
Right. And so the funding shifted, and so we were able to get into the Farm Bill in Washington and get federal dollars that would be shipped directly to it. And we've done a really great job of educating the legislators in Tallahassee, and money doesn't go to IFAS, it goes directly to CRDF. It doesn't fund scientists. And so you served on the CRDF board for a number of years. And what was the mood? I mean, it seemed to me that even though you had different backgrounds, everybody was pretty well focused. You had to pull a few things, like you said, to get long-term research, and then you were getting a lot of feedback from people about things that were working that you weren't funding. You know, you didn't get on the bandwagon to fund nutritional work that a grower in Felda was doing and was reporting from great success with it and everything else.
Well, we ultimately did.
We actually did, yeah.
You know, we did a lot of nutrition research and
But your
mimics
requirements were pretty stiff, though. I mean, I couldn't walk in and say, "Hey, I got this material that is a product that I've developed from sludge and it cures greening. Give me $5 million." But it's had
everybody did do that. I mean, we had tons of people walk in. We had the money, so we did attract.
But it had to be a proposal that, I mean, it had some basis.
scientific peer-reviewed proposal.
Yeah. But we had all that, and again, it's another interesting thing. I went back and studied the Spanish flu, and there was a guy named Dr. Jones, and you can still find bottles. Dr. Jones beaver liniment. He was selling beaver oil. I don't know how many poor beavers got slaughtered, but probably for their pelts. Right on the label, it says if you rub Dr. Jones beaver liniment on your chest, it will cure the Spanish flu. And if you don't have it, it will prevent you from getting it. So I'm studying this, and I'm thinking, this is like 1917? It was worse than COVID, percentage population-wise. It died. I mean, over 100 million people in the world died. It was a big deal. But the snake oil salesmen come out of the woodwork, just as they did with us in greening. And but I got thinking about it. If you rub beaver liniment on your chest and you died, you didn't show up. You didn't tell anybody. This guy's a fraud. It doesn't work. If you rubbed it on your chest and you survived, whether you, for whatever reason.
Thanks, Dr. Jones, man.
It's like, man, this stuff works great. And so there's a bias towards, and I saw that in citrus as people sold their grows for development or they lost to greening. They didn't show up at the meetings. The only people that showed up, they were saying,
or the ones dumb enough to hang in there. Right?
Well, no, they might have just been lucky and had a good piece of dirt and a good location, and their grow just was the strong survived longer and they thought it was some monkey dust they were spraying, and they were just lucky. But they said, "Hey, I put this out and my grow looks great." Okay, well those two things are true, but it doesn't mean that's what did it, So, and we just had a lot of that. So we had to sift through a lot of good proposals and bad proposals, and some that may have been good that we didn't think were good. I mean, that's just part of the human condition.
And it goes back even to this day about the public-private. The thing that's out there today that looks like it's buying us time is the OTC, the oxytetracycline. And I want to say, I have to think and go back to about 8 years ago, a grower showed up and said, we need to look at this closer. And I'm like, well, I thought we've already looked at it and all. And they're kind of like, no, this hasn't been looked at in as much detail as what people are doing now. And there's some groves out there that look pretty amazing. So it literally took 7 years to get that labeled. And part of it was the technology of how to deliver it effectively. At a 2 pH, it takes it right in. At an 8 pH, it just sits there and doesn't go into the tree. But my speaking of that is that ultimately it worked. Right. This mechanism of the research and all ultimately worked to quickly fund some of that stuff once we realized it. But could it have been faster to avoid some of the regulatory hoops? Yeah, probably could have been. And so we're all, we're on that path now with the Oxytec and seems to be making a big difference. But we're still early in the stages. We need more time. We need a couple of years because we've had hurricanes and cold weather to go with them, and it makes it difficult. But so it worked. Could it work better? Yeah, it can work better. But at least there was a mechanism to do it, to get it done. Because I remember we had a policy at the CRDF meetings is if a grower showed up, he could talk.
Right.
It didn't matter who he was, when it was. It didn't have to be ahead of time or anything. At the end of the meeting, chairman would turn around and say, anybody got anything to say? Well, this one grower would stand up, said, I think we need to look at this. And so we started a white paper. That's where it would start, to write down so that Dan Botts then could take that to the Department of Citrus or Department of Agriculture guys and say, what do you think? Let's, so it took a long time to get there, but we've got there. And so I can argue that it worked. Could it have been faster? Yeah, if we were a private entity, it'd be 2 phone calls and we'd be on the process. But we did get it to work, and doesn't mean it's the answer, but it's showing promise.
And I think we know now. I mean, I remember Turpin said this early, that greening is an extinction event. I mean, there was no known resistance or tolerance in the genome at the end of the day. And so, I mean, all species are doomed to extinction at some point in time. And this, so that's what we were fighting. That's how big this was. And we've seen the results in Florida, which unfortunately we predicted, and it was unfortunately correct. But we know a lot about it now, and now we may know enough to actually solve the problem after, yes, now we're 15 years into it, and hopefully it would have been better to have done it in 5. I don't know if that was even possible, no matter what we did, because it's such a hard problem.
We'd just be lucky.
Yeah.
Well, but we have the mechanism in place. Now, it seems to me, and my mission has changed. I'm too old to solve problems for growers, so I do this. I do the history. I try to tell the story, But CRDF still has adequate funding. I mean, the legislature and Florida legislature still provides money, and
well, I'm out of the loop now because I've been off for a while. But the answer to that is yes. I mean, there is still funding. It's at a reduced level from what it was at one time, but in the meantime, it kind of kicked IFAS in the tail too. IFAS started getting more money for more work that they could control, because if it was in our hands, they couldn't control it, so people naturally want to have control, so it initiated more work. Same thing with the USDA, and the USDA has a process now to work with private entities. It's a public-private relationship that they have to work with. So the mechanism's there. It's going after other diseases now. We have algae spot. We have this anthracnose that turns into glomerilla. That's a version of PFD, Calototricum. I mean, and so guess what? All of a sudden the growers look at it and say, wow, we need to look at this. There's a mechanism, that we can direct it quickly to do. So I'm proud of all that part of it. It's just when I look in the mirror, there's a few of those look in the mirror moments that I wish we'd have done differently. And the Brazilians were working with the gibberellic acids and 2,4-Ds before we were, and we tried to get our researchers to do it, and they came back and said, well, here's what we're going to research. And I said, well, that's great. I'm glad you're going to do that. I'll vote yes for that. But that isn't what the Brazilians did. This is what they did. Yeah, but they did this wrong, and they did. This is what's working. This is a guess. Is it going to work or not? This is really working. Why aren't we working at that? And we dropped it. And so here it is, 10 years later, we're looking at these plant hormones and all these things that go in there that seem to have a positive impact. And we had it on the table 10 years before that, but we let it slip off. You know, we went down one path. But anyway, we all have regrets that if we had to do it over again, but I'm proud of the effort that the industry made to come up with an organization to direct research in a more speedy fashion and in a well peer-reviewed fashion.
Well, I can see, you know, from my perspective as a county agent, so many times growers were the ones that came up with a solution, and then researchers came in and said, oh, let me tell you why that worked, because they did the deal. And so, and here's a deal, if it hadn't been for growers that hadn't realized what the problem was, where it was going to go, the magnitude of it, we'd still be floundering around in the old method of trying to get things done. And it's a shame we haven't come to a solution. I marvel, I get a call from somebody and tell me that their grove looks great. I need to go look at this grove down at Woodley Road. It's Valencia Grove, producing 400 boxes to the acre, 6-pound solids, you know, doing great. And then I hear a little later about a guy who's got a grove in the Green Swamp, and somebody's putting out treatments once a month, and he's got vernias that are producing 600 boxes to the acre and 6-7 pound solids. And I talked to Gary England, and he's got a block that Bill Lennon's looking at for on Buck Hill Road.
Yeah.
It's got about 40 quote Hamlin trees in there that are these trees in a totally infested greening grove are producing 400 boxes to the acre and 6.5 pound solids. So, damn, why aren't we taking this and doing it all over the state? You know, and Ed Stover gave me a long genetic lecture on why we weren't going to find an escape tree that was going to solve greening. And I have to admit it was beyond my pay grade. I didn't understand the genetics that were involved. But Gary tells me that they're now, that DPI is now propagating some of those trees that seem to be doing well. Buster Pratt would be thrilled if we find an escape tree that is the answer. Buster would have said, "I told you so."
Well, I have
told
people
you so.
come to me all the time and says, "Why don't we do that?" That was one of the first actions we ever took
And we are doing that.
with the escape tree. And yet the problem we found is, well, wait a minute, you got to check the microbes. You got to get a soil test, and we got to track these microbes because that changes everything. You know, so we literally, since the day the CRDF got started, or even before, but
So some things that have happened is, you know, here at the Department of Ag, so there is the craft program that is being run, and we're just monitoring, we're helping them monitor that. But the craft program is taking these good ideas and these different treatments, planting trees out across the state, plugging in these different treatments, and then modeling those, you know, and monitoring those to see what success is. There's an escape tree program where if you've got a tree that is still green, looks good, all his buddies are dead, okay, let's find out. So go and rescue that DNA, get it into a program where we can multiply it and plant it out. It's very, you know, and then we also now figured out you also have to take the rootstock, because a lot of times it's the rootstock that's mutated.
Sure.
And it's a zygote, not a Nucella rootstock.
Yeah, we'd love to have the problem solved by a rootstock. We could care less what you're putting on top of it.
And to Gary's point, there's still some science that's beyond anyone's understanding. Like in humans, we're just that far in understanding our gut microbiome. But now they're saying how important that is to human health. Same thing with the soil microbiome. It's different in different locations, and we've barely scratched the surface in any crop and anywhere in the world. we know it's important, but boy, there, you know, 1 teaspoon of soil has 1 trillion organisms in it, and we're supposed to sift and sort and figure out which ones are producing an antibiotic that actually works on greening. Well, hopefully one day we'll be able to do that. If artificial intelligence doesn't kill us all first, maybe it'll work for that.
Yeah.
Well, to me, this is a great story, and there's stories like this that happen all the time, that evolving things, and I'm optimistic that whether it's putting the oxytetracycline in there, or whether it's at Cherry Lake Tree Farm, they're putting 30 acres of red grapefruit under a cup or that screen house.
Yeah.
And
Oh, yeah.
so everybody's we're still fighting, and it just further reiterates to me that citrus growers, like most farmers, have some genetic flaw in them that says, in spite of all these damn obstacles, I'm going to continue to persevere. It's just amazing, isn't it, that we do it. And as soon as we solve one problem, there's another one out there. But let's just hope that we're able to get past this and we don't end up like the American chestnut that has completely vanished because whatever the virus that got into that, we couldn't find an answer to the solution. So it's not as if it hasn't ever happened in the past. It can. And if we don't persevere, that it's going to get away from us. So
I'll finish from my version to just say one more thing. We've not mentioned a fraction of the other people involved.
Right.
You know, other growers that were in every single meeting, the Jim Snively's and the, you know, just Steve Farr's and on and on and on growers that were there. We just happened to be sitting here today and we had something to do with it all, but boy, there's been a huge effort by this industry to bring this about.
And Gary's right about that. And I'll say what always impressed me was when we show up at our meetings, you could tell that people had actually read the proposals. And we were asking questions and going through the budget and going through the scientific, methodology and quizzing the scientists. And, we were all working 60 or 70 hours a week for taking care of our groves and then had to work 20 hours a week reading papers. And they, the committee members of probably 100 other people that were doing this, they did their job, took it seriously. So nobody was phoning it in, and it ended up being a lot of work. And I was always proud of the people that were doing it and took it seriously. And we had good, healthy debates. We didn't agree on everything, and that's healthy.
sure.
We can still go have a drink at the end of the day.
Well, that was it. Different opinions, but you finally reached a point where we were making an effort. We're still moving ahead. Well, it's been great, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed our visits to Washington and Gainesville and different things like that, and the committees. And he's a fifth or sixth or whatever generation, second, and for me it's so exciting because hell, I'm a city boy. I'm a first generation. This is all brand new to me. I grew up in downtown Orlando, and my wife grew up on a dairy. You talk about two different backgrounds, but to me, it's just always, it's so exciting to see what's happening, what's going on, and I got some other projects that I'm working on, and so it's a great industry, and I'm one who firmly believes that God has a plan for every one of us, and man, I'm sure glad that His plan included getting me stuck into the citrus industry and being able to get involved with guys like you, because it's been so uplifting to me and exciting. So we'll wrap it up. He's probably out of tape over here. The only other interview that we ran out of tape was Benny McClain, and his wife said he'd talk for an hour to a fence post, so it doesn't make any difference. So if you got anything else, any afterthoughts, we'll do it later. But right now, if you don't have anything else, and I'll thank you, Mr. Newlin.
Thank you, John, for doing
And
this.
Peter, your dad's really proud of you, I can tell you that.
Good seeing you, Jerry.